When people talk about black magic, I used to roll my eyes. I'd always dismissed it as superstition, an old-world belief that had no place in modern life. That was before I experienced something that made me question everything I thought I knew about the world, and about evil. It began innocently enough. A few years ago, I moved to a small town to start a new job. It was quiet, surrounded by dense forests and dotted with homes that seemed to have been there for centuries. My rented house was an old but charming cottage on the edge of town. The landlord, Mrs. Patel, was an elderly woman who warned me about one thing: never disturb the locked room at the back of the house. At the time, I thought nothing of it. She said the room was used for storage and contained some personal items she didn't want to remove. "It's just better left alone," she said. I didn't argue. The house was cheap, close to work, and the idea of one locked room wasn't enough to deter me. But as the days turned into weeks, little things started happening. Things I couldn't explain. At night, I'd hear faint knocking sounds, as though someone were tapping on the walls. Sometimes I'd wake up to find objects in my kitchen moved out of place. A chair pulled out, a glass moved to the counter. I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness, but deep down, it felt off. One evening, about a month after I moved in, I was cleaning the house and found a small, rusted key tucked behind one of the kitchen cabinets. It was old, with intricate designs etched into the metal. For a moment I stared at it, a chill running down my spine. Could this be the key to the locked room? I told myself to leave it alone, but the curiosity gnawed at me. Why was the room locked in the first place? What could be so important that Mrs. Patel wouldn't let anyone near it? That night, I barely slept, my thoughts consumed by the possibilities. The next day, I couldn't resist any longer. With the key in hand, I approached the locked door. My heart pounded as I turned the key in the lock. It fit perfectly, and with a soft click, the door creaked open. The smell hit me first, a mix of dust and something metallic like old blood. The room was small and dimly lit, with shelves lining the walls. On the shelves were jars filled with strange substances, powders, herbs, and what looked like animal bones. At the center of the room was a low wooden table covered in wax drippings, with a few melted black candles still standing. Symbols I couldn't decipher were carved into the wood, and an old weathered book lay open in the center. I should have left right then. Every instinct in my body told me to back away and lock the door behind me. But instead, I stepped inside. As I approached the table, the air grew colder. I felt a pressure, like an invisible weight bearing down on me. My fingers hovered over the book, its pages filled with strange diagrams and text in a language I didn't understand. Suddenly, I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft I thought I'd imagined it. I turned, expecting to see someone behind me. The room was empty. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. The whisper came again, clearer this time. It was a woman's voice, speaking in a language I didn't recognize. The sound wasn't coming from outside, it was inside the room. Panic set in. I slammed the book shut, intending to leave, but the moment I did, the door to the room slammed shut on its own. The candles flickered to life, their flames dancing wildly. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices. I pounded on the door, screaming for help, but no one could hear me. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room, a shadow darker than the rest seemed to peel away from the wall. It moved unnaturally, its form shifting and twisting. Two glowing eyes appeared, pinning me in place with their malevolent stare. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deep, guttural voice that spoke one word. "Why?" The shadow surged toward me, and I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed one of the jars from the shelf and hurled it at the figure. The jar shattered, and whatever was inside caused the shadow to recoil with an ear-piercing screech. In that moment, the door burst open, and I ran as fast as I could. I didn't stop running until I was outside, gasping for air. The house was silent again, but I could feel something watching me, waiting. I locked the room and called Mrs. Patel, demanding answers. When she arrived, her face was pale, and her hands shook as she clutched a string of prayer beads. "You opened it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't have opened it." She explained that the room had belonged to her grandmother, a practitioner of dark rituals. After her death, strange things began happening in the house, and the room was sealed to contain the energy within. Once you disturb it, she said, you invite it back. I wanted to leave the house that night, but Mrs. Patel convinced me to stay until she could perform a cleansing ritual. She brought a priest with her the next day, and together they performed prayers and burned incense throughout the house. For a while, it seemed to work. The atmosphere felt lighter, and the whispers stopped. But it didn't last. A week later, I woke up to find the symbols from the locked room carved into the walls of my bedroom. The candles I'd thrown away were back on the table in the living room, their wax drippings forming a strange pattern. And the whispers, they weren't just in the locked room anymore, they were everywhere. One night, I woke up to the sensation of something cold and heavy pressing down on my chest. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The shadow was there, looming over me, its glowing eyes burning with malice. It leaned in close, and for the first time, I understood what it was saying. You belong to me now. After the horrifying encounter, I knew staying in that house was no longer safe. But it wasn't as simple as packing up and leaving. Something from that room had attached itself to me. I could feel it, a constant oppressive presence lingering just out of sight. No matter where I went in the house, I could hear faint whispers or feel the weight of unseen eyes on me. Mrs. Patel and the priest had returned the following day to try another cleansing. They brought an older, more experienced spiritual healer with them, a man named Pandit Sharma. He examined the house carefully, his expression growing more grim with every room he entered. When he reached the locked room, he stopped cold. This is not ordinary, he said after a long silence. This is not something that can be undone easily. It will require great effort, and even then, I cannot guarantee success. I wanted to scream. I wanted to demand answers. What had I unleashed? How had it come to this? But all I could do was nod as the healer outlined what needed to be done. Pandit Sharma explained that the entity I had disturbed wasn't just a restless spirit, it was something far darker. A malevolent force summoned long ago and bound to this plane by the rituals practiced in that room. By opening the door and interacting with the objects inside, I had inadvertently weakened the seals that kept it confined. We must strengthen the barrier, he said. But first, we need to understand what it wants. The thought of communicating with the entity terrified me, but the healer insisted it was the only way to proceed. That night, he prepared a ritual to summon the entity into a controlled space. The idea was to confront it, to learn its purpose, and to establish stronger protections against it. The ritual took place in the living room, far from the locked room that had become the epicenter of its power. Candles were arranged in a precise pattern on the floor, and the air was thick with the scent of burning herbs. I sat in the center, clutching a talisman Pandit Sharma had given me for protection. As the chanting began, the room grew colder. The candles flickered, their flames bending toward an invisible force. The whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping until they formed a coherent voice. You cannot stop me, it hissed. The entity's presence was overwhelming. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch and twist, forming a shape that was almost human but not quite. Its glowing eyes fixed on me, and I felt a wave of nausea and fear crash over me. Why are you here? Pandit Sharma demanded, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. The entity's reply was chilling. I was summoned, bound, betrayed. Now, I will take what is mine. After the ritual, Pandit Sharma explained that the entity's cryptic words hinted at a dark history. Mrs. Patel reluctantly revealed more about her grandmother's practices. The old woman had dabbled in black magic, summoning spirits to do her bidding. But one ritual had gone horribly wrong. Instead of controlling the summoned entity, she had angered it. To protect herself, she had bound the entity to the room, using symbols and spells to contain its power. But the binding was flawed, and over the years, the entity had grown stronger, feeding off the energy of anyone who entered the house. It sees you as the one who freed it, Pandit Sharma explained. It will not stop until it has what it wants, or until it is banished for good. When I asked how we could banish it, he hesitated. "It will require a dangerous ritual," he said. "One that could cost you dearly if it fails." The ritual was scheduled for the following night. Pandit Sharma, Mrs. Patel, and a small group of assistants arrived with everything they needed: sacred powders, talismans, and items for an elaborate altar. The plan was to confront the entity once more, to sever its connection to our world and banish it to the void. As the ritual began, the air in the house grew heavy. The candles flickered violently, and the shadows deepened until the room was almost completely dark. The entity appeared again, more powerful than before. Its form was solid now, its glowing eyes burning with rage. "You cannot banish me," it roared, its voice shaking the walls. Pandit Sharma and his assistants chanted louder, their voices a desperate chorus against the entity's fury. I clutched my talisman tightly, repeating the protective mantra I had been taught. But the entity wasn't going down without a fight. It lashed out, sending a wave of cold energy through the room. One of the assistants collapsed, clutching his chest. The symbols on the altar began to glow, and for a moment I thought the ritual was working. But then the entity turned its attention to me. "You freed me," it snarled. "Now you are mine." The room erupted into chaos. The entity surged toward me, and I felt its icy grip close around my throat. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could hear was its voice, echoing in my mind. "Mine. Mine. Mine." In that moment, Pandit Sharma made a desperate decision. He grabbed the talisman from my hands and began chanting a different prayer. The entity screamed, its form writhing in pain as the talisman glowed with an intense light. "You cannot contain me forever," it roared, but its voice was fading. The shadows began to dissolve, sucked into the glowing talisman. When it was over, the room was silent. The entity was gone, and the talisman lay in Pandit Sharma's hands, now cracked and lifeless. But the cost was high. Pandit Sharma was pale and weak, his life force drained from the effort. "It is done," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But the house must be sealed. No one can live here again." I moved out the next day, leaving the cursed house and its dark history behind. Mrs. Patel had the house boarded up and blessed, ensuring that no one would ever disturb it again. Even now, I can still feel the entity's lingering presence, as though a part of it stayed with me. I don't know if I'll ever truly be free of it, but I've learned one thing: some doors are better left unopened. Leaving that house behind was supposed to bring me peace, but it didn't. For weeks after I moved, I felt the entity's presence clinging to me like a shadow. My new apartment, bright and modern, still didn't feel safe. I would wake up in the middle of the night to faint whispers or catch glimpses of dark shapes in the corners of my vision. Pandit Sharma had warned me this might happen. "It was attached to the house," he had said, "but you were the one who set it free. It may not let go of you so easily." In the days that followed, I tried to move on with my life, but the events of that house haunted me. My nights were filled with nightmares, and even in the light of day, I felt the weight of the entity's presence pressing down on me. But the worst came 2 weeks after I left the house. One night, I woke up to find the symbols from the locked room carved into the walls of my bedroom. My blood ran cold. The entity hadn't been banished, it had followed me. Desperate, I reached out to Pandit Sharma again. He was recovering from the previous ritual, but he agreed to meet with me. When I arrived at his home, he examined me carefully, as if searching for something hidden beneath the surface. "You have a mark," he said grimly. "The entity left a trace on your soul. As long as it remains, you will never be free." I didn't need him to explain further. I had felt it myself, the sense that a part of me was no longer my own, that the entity had claimed some piece of my essence. "There is only one way to remove the mark," he continued. "It will require a ritual of severance, but it is dangerous. The entity will fight back with everything it has." At this point, I didn't care about the danger. I couldn't live like this anymore, constantly looking over my shoulder, terrified of my own shadow. I agreed to the ritual, no matter the cost. The ritual was held at a sacred site outside the town, a place where the energy was said to be strong enough to combat dark forces. Pandit Sharma and his assistants prepared for hours, drawing intricate symbols on the ground and setting up protective barriers around the circle where I would sit. As the sun set, a sense of dread settled over me. The air felt heavy, charged with anticipation. When the ritual began, I sat in the center of the circle, clutching another talisman for protection. Pandit Sharma chanted prayers in a language I didn't understand, his voice steady and powerful. The assistants added their voices, and the air seemed to vibrate with the intensity of their words. Then, it happened. The shadows around the circle began to writhe and twist, forming shapes that were painfully familiar. The entity appeared again, more powerful than ever, its glowing eyes burning with rage. "You cannot sever me," it roared, its voice shaking the ground. The force of its presence was overwhelming. I could feel its anger, its desperation to hold on to me. The assistants struggled to maintain the protective barriers as the entity lashed out, sending waves of dark energy toward them. Pandit Sharma's chanting grew louder, more forceful. He held a sacred artifact in his hands, a small statue carved from black stone, which he raised high above his head. The entity screamed, its form distorting as if the light of the statue was burning it. But the entity wasn't done. It turned its attention to me, its shadowy form surging forward. I felt a cold, claw-like grip on my chest, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. "You belong to me," it hissed, its voice filling my mind. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I shouted the mantra Pandit Sharma had taught me. The talisman in my hand began to glow, and the entity recoiled with a piercing shriek. The ritual reached its climax. Pandit Sharma threw a handful of sacred ash into the circle, and the symbols on the ground burst into flames. The entity howled, its form unraveling as the flames consumed it. With one final deafening scream, the entity was gone. When the ritual ended, I collapsed to the ground, exhausted but alive. The oppressive weight I had felt for weeks was gone, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe freely. Pandit Sharma approached me, his face pale but relieved. "It is done," he said. "The mark has been removed. You are free." I thanked him and his assistants, words feeling inadequate for the gratitude I felt. They had risked their lives to save mine, and I would never forget their bravery. In the weeks that followed, I began to rebuild my life. The nightmares stopped, and the whispers were gone. I moved to a new city, far from the house and its dark history. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that the experience changed me. I've become more attuned to the unseen, more aware of the thin veil that separates our world from the unknown. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the entity and wonder if it's truly gone, or if it's waiting for another opportunity to return. One thing is certain, I will never again dismiss the power of black magic or the darkness it can unleash. This story isn't just a warning, it's a reminder that some things are better left undisturbed. Thank you for listening to my story. If you want to hear more scary stories, please like and subscribe to my channel.